Every currency is temporary. Some just feel permanent. Before the dollar, the pound wore the crown. Before the pound, the Dutch guilder set the rules. Each seemed unshakable, until trade moved, wars ended, debts mounted, and a different unit fit the world a little better. The dollar did not invent this role, it inherited it, and then rebuilt it for a larger, faster age. It married deep markets to predictable courts and a central bank that could flood the pipes when fear turned solid. It priced oil, shipped cargo, insured risk, and most important, cleared on the worst day. The guilder's gift was bookkeeping that behaved. The pound's gift was the craft of central banking and global clearing. The dollar's gift may be architecture, swap lines like fire hoses, auctions that never flinch, payments that cross oceans between midnight and morning. But permanence is not part of the contract. Technology is carving new channels, instant settlement, state digital cash, private rails that move value like a message. If the pipes change enough, does the cargo change with them, or does the dollar simply learn to travel lighter? Politics redraws the map. Sanctions turn money into policy. Nations build parallel systems to lower exposure, settling in local units, adding gold, writing contracts that hedge jurisdiction as much as price. Trust, slow to earn and quick to bruise, becomes the rarest asset of all. Economics sets the floorboards. Deficits test patience, demographics shift the weight of demand. New growth corridors want a say in the unit of account. A reserve currency can survive many doubts, but not the loss of credible assets or a lender that hesitates when the taps must open. If not the dollar, then what? Plan B is a race, not a speech. Maybe the end, if it comes, looks less like collapse and more like dilution, more trade in other units, more reserves in baskets, more contracts that quietly sidestep a single switch. Or maybe usefulness keeps winning, courts that work, markets that hold, a bid big enough to catch the fall. The crown may be heavy, the habit heavier. For the next 10 years, your personal Plan B store of value. Type one word in the comments to keep yourself honest later. Euro, yuan, gold, crypto, or none. For now, the evidence is plain. A ship takes fuel. A factory hedges copper. A government must roll debt by Friday. The wire hums in dollars. Complaints are real. Alternatives are growing. And yet, bills must be paid today. So the story continues, revised, tested, argued, and retold, each time a price prints and clears without drama. A last look, paper, ink, the familiar portrait. The edges soften, the fibers dissolve. The note becomes light, rectangles and lines drifting outward like constellations. A dollar fading into digital code, not vanishing, changing as the current moves on. Every empire writes its own money. This is how America picked its name, its look, and its promise. The law was inked. Now the dollar had to become real. A mint rose in Philadelphia, brick, bright windows, the hum of hand-turned presses. David Rittenhouse, astronomer and craftsman, took the first director's chair. Steel dies were cut by human hands, every line around Liberty's hair, every feather on the eagle carved with the care of a signature. The unit was not a slogan. It was a weight. 371 1/4 grains of pure silver made a dollar. Law turned metal into measure. Edges were milled with tiny ridges so no one could shave value without leaving a scar. Even the penalties spoke the new republic's seriousness. Debase the coin, and you risked your life. Trust would not be left to hope. Liberty faced forward on the coins. No king, no crown. The eagle spread over the reverse, a nation's emblem standing in for the old world's monarchs. Even the smallest denominations carried the lesson. Cents and half-cents in copper for bread and buttons, dimes and half-dimes in silver for everyday trade, eagles in gold for large payments and distant deals. A decimal ladder, simple enough for a child, sturdy enough for merchants. Yet, habit does not vanish when a law appears. Spanish dollars still rang on tavern tables, familiar and welcome. If change ran short, a coin might be cut, wedges nicked from the rim, pieces of 8. 2 bits for a quarter, 4 for a half. Language remembers what law replaces. Under the Act, gold and silver stood together, 15 ounces of silver named equal to 1 of gold. In theory, either metal could anchor the promise. In practice, the world's markets had their own ideas. When silver drew a higher price abroad than the law allowed, it left quietly. When gold was valued more elsewhere, it flowed the other way. A young nation learned the calm rule beneath every standard. Money moves toward advantage. For most people, paper arrived through banks, not Congress. State-chartered institutions printed notes redeemable in coin, local promises backed by the hope that redemption would be there on demand. The First Bank of the United States, Hamilton's creation, sat above them, a keystone for payments and public credit, its own notes traveling far because people believed they could be turned into metal at a glance. In pockets, coin did the counting. In ledgers, notes did the distance. The first cents told their own small story. A chain ringed the reverse, 13 links for 13 states. Critics saw bondage in the symbol and complained. The design changed to a wreath. Liberty stayed. The chain did not. Symbols are policy in miniature. Strikes were irregular at first. Dies broke, presses slipped. Silver dollars were scarce and coveted, copper cents came easier. But with each new year, the rhythm improved. Weights became truer. Quality rose. The nation's unit grew familiar in the hand and unremarkable in the mind. The surest sign any money has settled into life. Beyond the mint walls, the economy stitched itself together. Canals lowered costs, rivers carried bulk, turnpikes, and soon, rails mapped new paths for goods and coins. As distance shrank, uniform money mattered more. A dollar meant a dollar from Boston to Savannah. The decimal made reckoning clean across counties and states. Not every lesson was gentle. Panics visited early, credit rising too fast, then falling all at once. In those hours, paper turned back toward metal like birds to roost before a storm. The standard was more than a philosophy, it was a refuge. Congress adjusted when the world would not sit still. Later laws would tilt the gold-silver ratio, reduce the silver in small change so it stayed home, and eventually end the foreign coin's special status. Each change was an admission and an act of care. The standard must be tended if it is to be trusted. But in these beginnings, the victory was quieter. A uniform unit, a public mint, a promise in plain numbers enforced by public measure. For a people who had watched paper wither during war, the sound of a correctly weighted coin on wood was more than a payment. It was a reassurance. From there, the word dollar began to mean more than a piece of silver. It became a shared expectation, of value tomorrow, of fair dealing today, of a government willing to publish its weights and live by them. The road ahead would be rougher, battles over banks and standards, over paper and coin, over who may print and when. War would return, and with it, an entirely new kind of promise, one printed not for a state or a bank, but for a nation in crisis. A name had been chosen, a face engraved, a system set in motion. A name and a design were easy. Trust would take much longer. In gold, we trusted, and for a century, that trust barely broke. In the 19th century, money tried to be simple. Paper promised, metal proved. Across the Atlantic, Britain led the way. After war and suspension, the Bank of England resumed gold payments. The pound became a gold pound. Bills in the city settled with confidence because at the end of the chain, there was a bar you could touch. Ships left London with cargo and came back with contracts, all priced in a unit the world believed it could convert. America watched and argued. By law, the young republic stood on two metals, silver and gold, tied together at a fixed ratio, but markets move where laws do not. When world prices shifted, one metal left the stage. Silver coins were melted or exported when the ratio favored gold. Later, gold slipped away when silver had the advantage. The lesson was quiet but firm. The undervalued coin disappears. The overvalued one remains. Then a rush of sunlight struck the balance. California in 1848, Australian fields soon after. Gold grew less scarce, prices inched up, mints worked harder. Designers changed weights and fineness to keep coins at home. The system adjusted because it had to. Paper multiplied through banks. Notes were promises, redeemable in coin on demand. Trust in paper was really trust in the metal sitting behind a counter you might never see, guaranteed by a reputation you could feel in your hand. War disturbed the harmony. The Civil War forced the federal government to issue greenbacks, and gold payments were suspended. Paper floated, coin hid. After the guns fell silent, the next argument began. Should the nation harden its money again? Congress said yes. The Resumption Act set a date. In 1879, gold payments resumed. The dollar found its mettle once more. Abroad, the map was changing faster. Germany, newly unified and newly rich with war indemnities, shifted to gold. One by one, major economies joined the same anchor. By the late 1800s, an international gold standard linked prices and policies on both sides of the ocean. Gold moved, interest rates moved, the world adjusted. At home, silver would not leave quietly. Miners and farmers pushed for bimetallism, the free coinage of silver at a generous ratio to ease debts and lift prices. Congress compromised, first with limited silver purchases, then with more. Reserves thinned, doubt grew, and the country felt again how delicate convertibility could be when promises multiplied faster than confidence. The debate turned into theater. On one side, creditors, exporters, and the cities that lived on finance and trade, arguing for the clarity of gold. On the other, those crushed by falling prices and fixed debts, pleading for a broader base, a second metal to share the weight. The words were sharp because the stakes were personal. The standard decided who struggled and who slept. A manager's hand steadied the myth of automatic money. Central banks, notably the Bank of England, raised or lowered their discount rates to pull gold in or push it out to protect convertibility when seasons or panic strained the system. The mechanism felt mechanical. It was, in truth, carefully tended. Paper was power, only because you could turn it into metal on demand. By century's end, America made the choice formal. In 1900, the Gold Standard Act anchored the dollar to gold alone. Silver kept a minor role in small change. The promise at the core was now singular. This note for this metal at this price. For a generation, confidence held. A merchant in Buenos Aires could draw a sterling bill in London and convert value with few questions. A New York banker could settle with Paris, knowing the franc and the dollar would meet in gold. Telegraphs sped the words. Steamers moved the bars. The world grew used to a rhythm. Gold flowed, prices flexed, central banks adjusted, and convertibility survived. Underneath, strain gathered. Gold moved in ships, slowly. Information moved in cables, instantly. Economies became larger, faster, more tightly connected than the metal that was meant to bind them. The standard's beauty, its simplicity, was also its limit. For the people who lived under it, the gold era felt like honesty. A dollar was a weight, not a wish. For the people squeezed by it, it could feel like a vice. Wages sticky, debts rigid, prices falling when harvests or globalization flooded markets. Both were true. A standard is a promise, and every promise excludes something. The classical gold standard, polished by habit and guarded by policy, taught the world to trust paper because redemption was real. It taught governments to keep books honest because speculators and savers would test them if they did not. It taught citizens that money could be both a public symbol and a private comfort. It also taught how fragile strength can be when the world asks money to move faster than metal can sail. But gold was heavy, and the future would be light, fast, and fragile. On one August night, the dollar's anchor was cut, and it floated into uncharted seas. For a generation after the war, the rules were simple. $35 equaled 1 ounce of gold. Other nations tied their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar promised gold, not to everyone, only to foreign central banks, at that fixed price. Paper gained its calm from metal. Trade gained its rhythm from paper. By the late 1960s, the rhythm faltered. America was spending a distant war in Vietnam, new domestic programs at home. Dollars flowed out to pay for imports and bases abroad. Dollars piled up in foreign reserves. The world needed those dollars to do business. Yet the more it held, the less certain the promise behind them felt. Confidence lives on arithmetic. Gold in the vault moved one way. Commitments moved the other. In Europe, factories rebuilt and outcompeted. Germany and Japan exported with rising strength. Some leaders began to ask for gold instead of more paper. France sent for metal on principle. London's gold pool, once used to steady the market, cracked under pressure and broke. A two-tier system was invented to buy time, one price for central banks, another for everyone else. Time passed. Pressure grew. It had a name. The quiet dilemma at the heart of the system: for the world to trade, it needed more dollars. But the more dollars it held, the more it doubted they could all return to gold. Speculation is only a word for what people do when math and promises disagree. By 1971, the test was direct. Reserves thinned. Exchange rates strained. Some partners revalued, others let their currencies float for breath. In Washington, options narrowed to two: defend the promise at any cost, or change the promise. On the evening of August 15, 1971, the choice was made. A calm voice from the Oval Office. The United States would suspend convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, he said. Alongside it, a 90-day wage price freeze to break an inflation spiral and a new surcharge on imports to force negotiations. The phrase the world remembered was shorter. The gold window is closed. On paper, little seemed different the next day. $1 still bought a cup of coffee. But between nations, the ground shifted. Without the gold promise, fixed pegs were suddenly opinions. Realignments followed. The Smithsonian Agreement tried to patch the map with new parities and wider bands. Markets tested them and found them thin. By 1973, the old chart was gone. Major currencies floated. They rose and fell with trade balances, interest rates, and expectations, tides pulled by policy and belief rather than bars in a vault. This was the start of the fiat era, money by decree, value defined by institutions' credibility, and the willingness of strangers to hold what you print. Central banks learned a new language, signals, targets, guidance, because words now moved prices as surely as metal once did. Foreign exchange markets never slept. Hedging became habit. Risk found new routes, so did opportunity. The promise did not disappear, it changed. Instead of, "This note for this weight," it became, "This note will keep its power if we keep our word." For some, it felt like freedom, policy unshackled, growth unchained from a metal that could not grow on command. For others, it felt like drift, prices less anchored, discipline less enforced, the future more negotiable than it should be. Both feelings would be tested in the years ahead, when inflation pressed harder, rates climbed like ladders, and the dollar learned what it meant to be trusted without a tether. Without gold, the dollar's value would now be decided by belief alone. The world was broken, so it chose one currency to hold it together. Guns began, and gold stopped. In 1914, one bell rang on a Sarajevo street, and, within weeks, great capitals shuttered their gold windows. Notes kept circulating. Promises multiplied. Armies needed steel, bread, and fuel more than convertibility. Paper financed trenches. Prices rose with the smoke. When the silence returned, the world tried to rewind the clock. Britain reached for the old pre-war parity and, in 1925, set sterling back onto gold at yesterday's price. The number was elegant. The economy was not. Wages and exports strained under a heavier currency. Others improvised. A gold exchange system took shape, with reserves held not only in metal but also in sterling and dollars. It worked until it didn't. Credit ran hot in the late 1920s. Then in 1929, markets inhaled and never exhaled. Banks failed. Trade curled inward. Gold piled up where fear was greatest, especially in New York and Paris, and drained from weaker centers. In 1931, a bank in Vienna stumbled. Panic leapt across borders. Britain abandoned gold. Many followed. The parities that had seemed like law were revealed as choices. In America, 1933 brought a bank holiday. People lined up with questions the counters could not answer. The new administration halted domestic gold convertibility, recalled bullion, and reset the price, $35 for an ounce of certainty, trying to lift prices and steady expectations. Elsewhere, currencies were devalued, pegged, or simply managed day by day. Capital controls bloomed. Trade became a series of bilateral bargains, neighbors unpegged from neighbors. The lesson cut deep. A global standard cannot survive on arithmetic alone. It needs institutions, places to borrow in trouble, rules to share adjustment, a way to keep faith when one country's cure is another's pain. War returned, and with it, a different arithmetic. The United States sent ships, machines, and grain across oceans. Payments followed paths called lend-lease and settlement accounts. By the time the fighting waned, American factories were unbombed, its debts manageable, and its vaults heavy. Gold had flowed toward safety, receipts had piled into dollars. The map of power and the map of money began to overlap, so the world met in the mountains to design a peace for finance. In the summer of 1944, delegates gathered under high ceilings and argued late into the night. One vision proposed a brand new international money. Another, a system built around the currency already at the center of trade. The compromise was practical. Anchor the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. convertible for official holders, and let other currencies peg to the dollar at declared par values, adjustable when fundamental disequilibrium arrived. Fixed, but not frozen. Two new institutions held the frame. The International Monetary Fund would be a place to borrow when tides ran out, a union of mutual support to defend parities, mediate adjustments, and discourage beggar-thy-neighbor devaluations. The World Bank, born as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, would finance bridges, power stations, and the slow, expensive work of rebuilding and development. One for balance of payment storms, one for long horizons. Capital controls were not a flaw. They were part of the truce, giving nations room to heal without being whipsawed by hot money. Trade would reopen. Currencies would, in time, restore convertibility for everyday transactions. And at the center sat a promise. If a central bank arrived at the U.S. Treasury's door with dollars, it would receive gold at a known price. Paper gained its calm from metal once more, indirectly through the dollar. For a quarter century, that arrangement stitched together a fractured world. Ships moved under predictable invoices. Prices were quoted in a unit everyone understood. When strain appeared, loans and consultations followed before panic could spread. The war had ended the old order. The conference gave the new one a clock and a compass. But even a king needs a kingdom willing to follow. On one August night, the dollar's anchor was cut and it floated into uncharted seas. For a generation after the war, the rules were simple. $35 equaled 1 ounce of gold. Other nations tied their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar promised gold, not to everyone, only to foreign central banks at that fixed price. Paper gained its calm from metal. Trade gained its rhythm from paper. By the late 1960s, the rhythm faltered. America was spending. A distant war in Vietnam. New domestic programs at home. Dollars flowed out to pay for imports and bases abroad. Dollars piled up in foreign reserves. The world needed those dollars to do business, yet the more it held, the less certain the promise behind them felt. Confidence lives on arithmetic. Gold in the vault moved one way. Commitments moved the other.
In Europe, factories rebuilt and outcompeted. Germany and Japan exported with rising strength.
Some leaders began to ask for gold instead of more paper. France sent for metal on principle. London's gold pool, once used to steady the market, cracked under pressure and broke. A two-tier system was invented to buy time. One price for central banks, another for everyone else. Time passed, pressure grew. It had a name. The quiet dilemma at the heart of the system. For the world to trade, it needed more dollars, but the more dollars it held, the more it doubted they could all return to gold. Speculation is only a word for what people do when math and promises disagree. By 1971, the test was direct. Reserves thinned, exchange rates strained. Some partners revalued, others let their currencies float for breath. In Washington, options narrowed to two: defend the promise at any cost, or change the promise. On the evening of August 15, 1971, the choice was made. A calm voice from the Oval Office. The United States would suspend convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, he said. Alongside it, a 90-day wage price freeze to break an inflation spiral and a new surcharge on imports to force negotiations. The phrase the world remembered was shorter. The gold window is closed. On paper, little seemed different the next day. $1 still bought a cup of coffee. But between nations, the ground shifted. Without the gold promise, fixed pegs were suddenly opinions. Realignments followed. The Smithsonian Agreement tried to patch the map with new parities and wider bands. Markets tested them and found them thin. By 1973, the old chart was gone. Major currencies floated. They rose and fell with trade balances, interest rates, and expectations. Tides pulled by policy and belief rather than bars in a vault. This was the start of the fiat era. Money by decree. Value defined by institutions' credibility and the willingness of strangers to hold what you print. Central banks learned a new language, signals, targets, guidance, because words now moved prices as surely as metal once did. Foreign exchange markets never slept. Hedging became habit. Risk found new routes, so did opportunity. The promise did not disappear. It changed. Instead of this note for this weight, it became this note will keep its power if we keep our word. For some, it felt like freedom. Policy unshackled, growth unchained from a metal that could not grow on command. For others, It felt like drift, prices less anchored, discipline less enforced, the future more negotiable than it should be. Both feelings would be tested in the years ahead, when inflation pressed harder, rates climbed like ladders, and the dollar learned what it meant to be trusted without a tether. Without gold, the dollar's value would now be decided by belief alone. Every nation needed oil, and oil needed dollars. The 1970s smelled like crude and inflation. Tankers lined up off warm water ports. Refineries burned at the horizon. In boardrooms and war rooms alike, a single question set the price of everything else. What pays for oil? After the dollar left gold, the world needed a new anchor. It found one in a barrel. The Arab-Israeli War and the embargo that followed jolted prices upward. Overnight, energy costs multiplied. Importers begged. Exporters bargained. And in the space between them, the United States saw a way to steady the system and save its currency. A deal took shape. Part diplomacy, part arithmetic. Saudi Arabia, the swing producer and quiet leader within OPEC, would price oil in U.S. dollars. Not in francs, not in pounds, not in a basket of currencies, dollars only. In return, the United States would provide security, equipment, and a reliable market for the kingdom's crude. The understanding spread. Where oil flowed, dollars would flow first. From then on, a chain reaction clicked into place. Every country that needed fuel, factories in Europe, buses in India, power plants across Asia, had to hold dollars to pay for it. Central banks built dollar reserves as a matter of survival. Commercial banks built dollar pipelines to move cash to the right port at the right hour. The price of energy created demand for the currency that priced it. The dollars that left the United States to buy oil did not disappear. They circled back. Producers earned more than they could spend at home. The surplus, petrodollars, had to live somewhere safe and liquid. So they returned to U.S. treasuries, to big bank deposits, to dollar bonds in markets that hardly slept. The capital flowed through London's Eurodollar desks, through New York's money markets, through accounts in Geneva and Bahrain, quiet rooms where numbers moved faster than ships. This was petrodollar recycling. Oil importers sent dollars out, oil exporters sent dollars back by investing in U.S. assets. American deficits met foreign surpluses in a marriage of convenience. Demand for safe dollar assets became as global as the thirst for fuel itself. The arrangement did more than settle invoices. It built a habit. Treasury securities, the IOUs of the U.S. government, became the world's savings account, deep, transparent, and, most important, there. When prices spiked, producers bought more. When prices fell, reserves still sat in U.S. custody, ticking interest. Liquidity begat liquidity. The more the world used dollars to buy energy, the more it wanted dollars to store the proceeds. For Washington, the benefits compounded. The same currency that paid for oil also financed the deficit at home and the current account abroad. The U.S. could run short of goods and long on influence, exporting claims on its future in exchange for the world's present needs. It wasn't free, but it was cheaper than any alternative on offer. For banks, a new business bloomed. Dollar deposits from oil exporters, vast, sudden, needed to earn. They were lent onward to sovereigns and companies hungry for growth. This river of credit lifted ports, pipelines, and skylines. It also planted the seeds of the next crisis when interest rates soared later in the decade. Many borrowers learned how unforgiving a dollar loan can be. For the dollar, the network effect hardened into logic. If oil is priced in dollars, then shipping, insurance, and hedging migrate to dollars. If hedges are in dollars, balance sheets need dollars. If balance sheets need dollars, central banks stock dollars. Round and round, trust reinforcing itself until it felt like gravity. The system had critics. Some called it dependence disguised as convenience. Others argued for pricing oil in a neutral unit, special drawing rights perhaps, or in multiple currencies. But switching the unit of account is like rewiring a city in the dark. The pipes already ran in dollars, the meters read in dollars, the contracts spoke in dollars. Habit, speed, and depth kept the temporary solution permanent. Second shocks proved the point. Revolution in Iran. War in the Gulf. Each rupture sent prices surging, and with them fresh tides of petrodollars into the same safe harbors. The harder the world shook, the more it clutched the currency that cleared the most important bill on earth. Oil linked energy to finance. Finance linked today's payments to tomorrow's promises. By the end of the decade, a quiet architecture spanned oceans, security arrangements, long-term supply contracts, and an unspoken understanding that dollar stability was everyone's business because oil stability was everyone's need. The emblem was not a treaty, it was a routine. A cargo is nominated, a letter of credit is confirmed. A wire moves before dawn. Somewhere, a treasury auction settles. Somewhere else, a central bank's dollar line grows by a few digits. No speeches required. The petrodollar era did not make the dollar inevitable. It made it useful, and usefulness is the most persuasive argument money has. Energy lit the dollar's fire, but finance would keep it burning. When fear rises, the dollar tightens its grip. Inflation had turned daily life into a slow slide. Prices climbed without asking. Paychecks struggled to keep up. The United States reached for a hard cure. A tall central banker in a dark suit raised interest rates into the high teens, high enough to make money scarce again, high enough to wring inflation out of the walls. Factories dimmed. Farm auctions filled county squares. The cure hurt, but it sent a message across oceans. The dollar would be defended by policy, not hope. When U.S. rates leap, capital runs uphill. Dollars came home. The currency surged. Imports looked cheap. American exporters winced. Abroad, debts that had been borrowed in dollars during easier times suddenly grew heavier. Revenues in local currency, obligations in a unit that was getting stronger by the week. In 1982, a large borrower at the nation-state scale said it could not pay. Others lined up behind it. Restructurings, rescue packages, and a new phrase, the debt crisis, entered the nightly news. An entire region learned how quickly a dollar boom can become a dollar bind. By the middle of the decade, strength had become its own problem. The dollar's rise distorted trade and diplomacy alike. Finance ministers met under chandeliers in New York and agreed to guide the currency down in an orderly way. The signal from the Plaza Hotel was simple. Together they would lean against the dollar. The yen and the mark rose. The dollar slid. 2 years later, a second meeting tried to hold the new alignment in place, a reminder that floating exchange rates still had pilots when turbulence hit. At home, the fever broke, inflation fell, growth resumed. A quieter confidence took hold. It had a slogan, not a number, a strong dollar policy. The line meant different things to different ears, open markets, deep liquidity, no deliberate devaluation, but the effect was clear. Capital kept flowing toward the United States. The dollar's role as the world's safe storage locker deepened. The 1990s tested that role again and again. In Mexico, a peg snapped, money fled, a rescue package arrived in days. In East Asia, currencies that had seemed firm unraveled in sequence. Balance sheets built on short-term dollar borrowing and long-term local lending met a wall of fear. Rates spiked, pegs broke, growth reversed. In Russia, default spread from bonds to belief, and a hedge fund in New York engineered to survive nearly anything found the one day it could not. Each time, investors dumped what they owned and ran for one thing, treasuries. Depth and a bid, those two simple features, turned a national market into a global shelter. The pattern was not complicated. In calm, the world diversified. In stress, it simplified. The same habit repeated, sell what is narrow, buy what is deepest. The dollar's advantage was not only size, it was the presence of a buyer when everyone else stepped back. Coordination matured with each shock. Policymakers learned to speak carefully, to act quickly, to leave doors half open for capital to return. International institutions refined their playbooks. Central banks watched one another's shadows and, when needed, cut together. The choreography never removed the pain, but it shortened the panic. If you lived through those years, you may remember one number, the mortgage rate that made you swallow hard, the currency swing that changed a job, the yield that looked impossible until it wasn't. Type the number you remember most. Seeing them side by side turns history into something you can touch. Strength, though, has two edges. A currency that catches the world when it slips also becomes the thing the world cannot let go of. Countries carried larger reserves just in case, often stored in the very market they sometimes resented. Corporations hedged more, borrowed shorter, checked the screen more often. The system became safer by becoming more dependent on the same anchor. By the century's turn, the map was legible. When fear rises, the dollar tightens its grip. When fear fades, the world loosens its fingers. Until the next surprise. Safe haven or golden cage, the line is thin. Every crown invites rivals, and the dollar's crown is heavy. First came a new flag of money over Europe. 12 countries gave up their notes and coins to share one. The euro. It began as numbers on screens, banks and markets in a common unit. Then, a few winters later, as bills and coins in the hand. One central bank, one interest rate, many governments. The promise was scale without empire, a market as large as America's with a currency to match. Strengths were obvious: deep trade, strong institutions, the rule of law. Limits were quieter, no single treasury, different debts, different cycles. When strains hit in the early 2010s, bond markets asked a hard question: who stands behind whom and how far? The answer, whatever it takes, was enough to steady the ship. The euro remained Plan A for Europe, and for some savers, a partial Plan B to the dollar. Then came a rising workshop of the world, with a currency still learning to travel. China's renminbi, the yuan, rode the country's trade to every port. Invoices shifted, swap lines spread. An offshore yuan market bloomed so money could move even when the mainland was closed. A new payment system, built to work even if others said no, clicked on. Oil and metals began to see contracts in yuan. Central banks took small bites for their reserves. Even a digital yuan appeared, a state-built rail humming through phones. Ambition was clear: settle more trade in the national unit and keep more value at home. But money that wants to be global must answer global questions. Can it leave as easily as it arrives? Are the courts predictable? Are the markets wide enough to hold panic without breaking? China moved step by step, widening in some places, holding tight in others. For many partners, especially those under sanctions or pressure, the yuan became useful. For most savers, it was not yet home. A third challenger did not ask any government's permission. Bitcoin arrived as code and a proposal. Trust math, not ministries. It settled across borders at midnight, indifferent to policy, stubborn against seizure, volatile in price, but steady in rules. Around it grew other experiments: smart contracts, tokenized dollars, new pipes for old money. Ironically, the most used crypto for trade was often a stablecoin that pointed back to the dollar. Digital wrappers that made the dollar faster, not smaller. Individuals in fragile economies found a lifeline, institutions found a sandbox, regulators found headaches. Crypto did not replace the dollar. It rerouted it and offered a template for any country that wants money to move at the speed of text. Across all three, euro, yuan, crypto, the same project appeared under different flags. De-dollarization, not a single act, but 1,000 nudges. Paying for energy in something else, settling bilateral trade in local currencies, adding gold to reserves, building new banks and new rails, testing baskets and tokens, widening the menu so the world is less beholden to one kitchen. Some of it was politics, some prudence, some pride. Network effects pushed back. The dollar lives where contracts are written, where courts are trusted, where markets are deepest at the worst moment of the worst day. Liquidity is a habit. Habits harden into infrastructure. To dislodge a standard, a rival must be not just good, but better when it matters. Still, the race continues, quietly, steadily. If you had to choose a personal Plan B store of value for the next 10 years, one word only: euro, yuan, gold, crypto, or none, what would you type? Drop it in the comments. Pinning your word now will make the end of this series more honest. Rivals are not only currencies, they are rules. Who can sanction whom? Who can see what? Who can shut which switch? The more the dollar is used as a lever of policy, the stronger the incentive to build around it. The more others build around it, the more the dollar must prove that convenience beats control. The crown is heavy. The field is crowded. The habits are deep. If not the dollar, then what? Follow the quiet race to be Plan B. The world's most used, most questioned, most unshakable currency. The 21st century tested the dollar in ways no metal could have endured. First, 2008. The panic did not begin as a stock chart. It began as a shortage of dollars. Mortgage securities cracked, trust snapped. Banks that once lent overnight would not lend at all. Money market funds broke the buck. Spreads, those tiny gaps that oil the system, blew wide. Around the world, firms needed dollars to roll debts and pay suppliers. The dollars were there. Just no one would part with them. The Federal Reserve did something quiet and enormous. It opened swap lines to other central banks, Europe, Japan, the UK, and more, lending dollars against their currency so they could lend onward at home. Liquidity flowed through pipes most people never see. At the same time, the Fed bought bonds, backstopped markets, and the Treasury recapitalized banks. You can debate the winners and the wounds, but in the end, payments cleared, shelves filled, and the system stood up again. The lesson was blunt: in a storm, the world needs a dollar lender of last resort. And there is only one. A decade later, a different kind of shock. 2020. A virus paused the planet. In March, everything that could be sold was sold. Investors dashed for cash. Even safe bonds wobbled. Again, the Fed reached for the same hidden toolkit. Swap lines reopened and expanded. A new facility let foreign central banks repo their treasuries for dollars, and an alphabet of programs steadied funding. Within weeks, the dash for cash became a deep, still pool. The dollar had proven twice that it can flood the world on demand. Sanctions turned money into a lever of statecraft. Lists grew longer, banks screened harder, whole sectors, and then, one day, central bank reserves could be frozen. The message traveled farther than any press release. Assets are safe, until policy says they aren't. Some countries began to reroute, building alt-rails, settling trade in local currencies, adding gold, experimenting with new payment systems. De-dollarization moved from slogan to slow practice. And yet, when fear rises, people reach for what clears today. A container ship needs fuel. A manufacturer needs inventory. A government needs to roll debt by Friday. For that, they reach for dollars, treasuries, and the markets that take $1 trillion in stride without blinking. This is the paradox, resented but required. Critics point to deficits, politics, and the power woven into the pipes. Supporters point to courts, transparency, and the one thing that matters on the worst day, a bid big enough to catch the fall. Both are right. The dollar is a tool and a tether, convenience and constraint. If you had to choose your 72-hour emergency asset, the thing you'd hold while everything wobbles, type one word in the comments: cash, treasuries, gold, BTC, or other. Pin it now. Check it again at the end of this series. The dollar's future won't be decided by headlines. It will be decided by use. Who invoices in it, who saves in it, and who lends it when the lights flicker. Rivals will grow. Alternatives will get faster. Some reserves will diversify. But every day, bills must be paid, cargoes settled, and risks hedged. For that, the world still reaches into the same deep pool. Power built on need.
How paper
one
from
has
one
stopped needing
country
it.
became everyone's problem and everyone's plan. Watch the glow of trading screens, ports exhaling steam. Before dawn, a vendor in Lagos handing change, a tourist in Lima tipping the guide, a refinery in Singapore booking a shipment, a minister in Prague signing a bond. The same invisible current runs through them all. Dollars, flicking like swallows between ledgers and lives. How did paper from one nation become the backbone of global trade, savings, and power? And how long can that last? Before the dollar, America counted in many tongues. Colonial shops wrote prices in shillings and pence that didn't match from Boston to Charleston. Spanish pieces of 8 rang on tavern tables because they were heavy, honest silver known from Havana to Canton. Farmers kept ledgers in tobacco and grain. And when hard coin drained away to pay for imports, the colonies learned to live on paper promises, local bills of credit that kept trade alive until trust thinned and value sagged. Revolution made the problem urgent. The Continental Congress had soldiers to feed and no full power to tax, so it reached for the press. Crisp Continentals paid for powder and bread until too much paper chased too few goods, and British counterfeiters salted the wound. A phrase entered the language like a shrug: not worth a continental. The war delivered independence, not a stable unit of account. The new republic chose to build one. Thinkers argued for a system that ordinary people could carry in their head, 10s, not 12s. Congress quietly picked the dollar as the national unit, then wrote the Coinage Act of 1792. A mint rose in Philadelphia. Weights, not wishes, defined the unit. Silver by the grain, gold by ratio. The design carried a lesson. Liberty's face, not a king's. An eagle's spread, not a crown. Even the smallest coins preached Republican plainness. The plan was bimetallic, gold and silver together, fixed at a legal rate. In practice, the world had its own arithmetic. When the market valued silver more richly than the law, silver coins flowed out and melted down. When gold fetched a better price overseas, eagles vanished into ships' holds. Americans learned a rule that no statute could cancel. Money moves toward advantage. Still, the system worked because the mint kept standards, and people believed those standards would hold tomorrow. Paper returned, this time through banks. State-chartered institutions issued notes redeemable in coin. The First Bank of the United States stood above them, its promises traveling far because redemption was real. Coins did the counting in pockets. Bank paper did the distance in ledgers. Panics came early, quick climbs in credit followed by abrupt falls. But the standard gave people a place to stand when the floor shook. Then the earth itself glittered. Gold rushed out of California and Australia, tilting the metal balance and the price level with it. Lawmakers trimmed weights and fineness so coins would stay home instead of sailing away. The Civil War cut deeper than any ratio. Washington printed greenbacks, national promises not redeemable in gold, because the choice was that or fail. Coin hid, paper floated. The country learned that sometimes survival means bending the rule and then spending a decade unbending it. In 1879, the Treasury resumed gold payments. The habit of redemptions revived. The world was converging. Germany, newly unified and newly paid indemnities, adopted gold. Others followed. By century's end, an international gold standard linked bills in London, New York, Paris, and beyond. Trade bills cleared with few questions, because at the end of the chain there was a bar you could touch. The Bank of England managed the myth of automatic money with a very human tool: its discount rate, cooling or warming the flow of gold, so convertibility would survive the seasons and the scares. At home, silver refused to leave the stage. Miners and farmers, squeezed by falling prices and fixed debts, argued for free coinage of silver to widen the base of money. Creditors and exporters answered that clarity mattered more than generosity. Congress compromised, then compromised again, and the Treasury watched reserves thin. Out of that fight came a closing of ranks. The Gold Standard Act of 1900, a singular promise engraved beneath the whole financial architecture. This note for this metal at this price. For a generation, it worked. Telegraphs carried words faster than ships could carry bullion. Yet the rhythm held, gold flowed, rates adjusted, prices flexed, convertibility endured. The beauty of the standard, its simplicity, was also its limit. It kept governments honest because redeemability could be tested any morning. It squeezed anyone trapped between sticky wages and falling prices. It made money feel like a fact. It made adjustment feel like a vice. Both were true. Guns began, and gold stopped. In the summer of 1987-14, great capital suspended convertibility within weeks. Armies needed steel and bread, not redemptions. Paper financed trenches. Prices rose with the smoke. When silence returned, Britain tried to rewind the clock to the old parity and discovered that yesterday's number on today's economy was a stone in the pocket. Others improvised a gold exchange standard, holding reserves not only in metal, but in sterling and dollars. It worked until credit ran too hot and then froze. 1929 inhaled and never exhaled. Banks failed. Trade curled inward. Gold piled up where fear was greatest and drained from weaker places. Parities that had looked like law collapsed into choices. America declared a bank holiday in 1933. Counters could not answer simple questions. The new administration halted domestic convertibility, recalled bullion, reset the price, and tried to lift the whole level of prices and confidence at once. Around the world, governments devalued, pegged, or simply managed day by day. Capital controls bloomed like weeds through sidewalks. The global standard had failed its hardest exam, not because arithmetic changed, but because institutions were not built to share pain and lend in storms. War made the arithmetic simpler and the map starker. The United States sent ships, machines, and grain across oceans, paid through lend-lease and accounts that only specialists could explain. By the time the fighting ebbed, American factories were intact, its debts manageable, and its vaults heavy. Gold had moved toward safety. Receipts had piled up in dollars. Military power and monetary centrality overlapped for the first time on such a scale. So the world climbed into the mountains to give peace a financial shape. Delegates argued under high ceilings in a hotel whose name would become a shorthand for an era. One camp dreamed of a new supranational money. Another said the practical path ran through the currency already at the center of trade. The compromise knit both instincts. Fix the dollar to gold at 35 per ounce, convertible for foreign central banks, and let other currencies peg to the dollar with declared parities, adjustable in fundamental disequilibrium. Fixed, but not frozen. Trade would regain a heartbeat. Adjustment would have rules rather than panic. Two institutions held the frame together. One was a lender between nations, a place to borrow when tides ran out and to coordinate changes before disorder fed on itself. The other was a bank for long projects, bridges, power, the patient work of building and rebuilding. Capital controls were not a glitch in this system. They were part of the truce, giving countries room to heal without being whipsawed by hot money. Convertibility for daily trade would return first. The rest would come as patience and production allowed. For a quarter century, the arrangement worked as if it were the natural shape of things. Ships sailed under predictable invoices. Prices were quoted in a unit everyone understood. When strain appeared, officials consulted, loans were made, and parities bent rather than snapped. The dollar was not a king by proclamation. It was a hinge, one side metal, the other paper. All of it attached to American law, markets, and the promise that when official holders arrived with claims, the Treasury would settle in gold. A currency wears a crown only if others agree to bow at the hard moments, the hours when invoices must clear and savings must feel safe. For that, the system depended on more than the mint and the statute. It rested on the reach of contracts written in dollars, the depth of markets that could absorb panic without breaking, and the discipline of a central bank that would defend the standard even when it hurt at home. But even a king needs a kingdom willing to follow. Confidence lives on arithmetic. Gold in the vault moves one way, commitments move the other. As the 1960s wore on, war abroad, programs at home, allies rebuilt and competitive, a quiet mismatch grew. Friendly central banks held more and more dollar claims because that was the grease for trade. The more they held, the more they asked whether all claims could be turned into metal at the posted price if the day ever came. A dilemma hid in plain sight. For the world to trade, it needed more dollars. The more dollars it held, the less convertible the dollar looked. And somewhere inside that irony, the next chapter of the dollar's story was coiling. The dollar's rise to the center of the map was not inevitable. It was constructed by weights and decimals, by symbols that rejected kings and promised law, by a mint that kept measure and banks that kept faith, by the hard decision to suspend and the harder decision to resume, by the international choice to anchor post-war life to a unit that was already doing the work. It succeeded because it was useful on the worst day as well as the best. It also inherited fragilities from every era it survived, the tension between rules and discretion, between national goals and global roles, between the tidy beauty of metal and the messy pace of modern economies. Hold the image, a glass globe lit half in green, half in gold, oil ribboning into circuits, a crown of invisible wires hovering just beyond the reach of any single hand. That is the dollar at mid-century, monarch by consent, servant of trade, promise stitched to a bar of metal that ships could carry and treasuries could count. The storm was already building beyond the horizon, where arithmetic, politics, and ambition would meet on one televised evening and cut the tether that had defined money for generations. For now, let the last line rest the way it did in trading rooms and central banks as the post-war order matured. The dollar clears, the invoice sails, the bar waits in the vault, and the world, still healing, chooses to trust the hinge that made its commerce possible. The rhythm failed slowly, then all at once. Deficits widened. Ships left American ports full of paper promises and came back with steel, oil, and obligations. Europe healed faster than expected. Factories in Germany and Japan learned to outcompete on quality and cost. Central banks overseas stacked dollars because dollars were the grease of trade, and the more they stacked, the more they ran the arithmetic with a pencil's hard point. There was not enough gold in the vault to redeem every claim at the posted price, not if the day came when confidence asked for metal instead of words. Signals flashed in quiet rooms. Dealers who once steadied the gold price in London, an informal pool that sold when markets ran hot and bought when they cooled, found they were bailing a tide with a teacup. A two-tier compromise tried to buy time, one market for official trades at the sacred price, another for everyone else at whatever the day demanded. Time, briefly, was bought. Pressure kept building. A televised voice did what careful communiques could not. On a warm evening, the president told the country and the world that the United States would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. Alongside the sentence came a wage price freeze and an import surcharge to force allies to renegotiate. 3 words did the real work. The window closed. The next morning, coffee still cost $1 and a newspaper, but between nations, the floorboards shifted. Pegs that had felt like granite showed their grain. Finance ministers huddled, posted new parities, widened bands, and hoped the weather would change. Markets tested and leaned until one by one the pegs gave way. Within 2 years, the great currencies floated, rising and falling with trade balances, interest rates, and expectation itself. Money by decree. Fiat. The promise changed from "this note for this weight" to "this note keeps its power because our institutions are credible and our policies will defend it." Central banks learned a new language: signals, targets, corridors, guidance. Traders learned a new reflex: hedge. Currencies that had been furniture became weather. Risk moved from vaults into screens. Yet even as gold receded, a different anchor took shape in the shadows. Offshore dollars, Eurodollars, deposited in London and Hong Kong and Nassau, lent and relent beyond the Federal Reserve's direct reach. They were American in unit, global in habitat. They allowed firms to borrow in the currency that cleared the world's bills without passing through New York. Banks called it innovation. Regulators called it a headache. The machinery called it lubrication and sped up again. Then energy lit the fuse. War flared in the Middle East. An embargo tightened. The price of oil leapt. Importers queued for fuel and paid whatever the bill said. Exporters earned more than they could spend at home. In the space between those two facts, the petrodollar arrangement crystallized. Oil would be priced in dollars. Security and equipment would flow in the other direction. Where oil flowed, dollars would flow first, and then circle back as savings, poured into the deepest, most liquid, most lawyered market on earth. A routine replaced a treaty. A cargo was nominated. A letter of credit opened. Shipment proof traveled in telexes. A wire moved before dawn. Dollars left Houston, Rotterdam, Yokohama for crude, and came home as deposits in big banks, as reserves on central bank balance sheets, as bids at treasury auctions. Petrodollar recycling sounded abstract. It was just habit wearing a new trench. The stronger the oil price, the thicker the river of savings back into dollar assets. Liquidity begat liquidity. A barrel somewhere meant a buyer at a bond auction here. The bargain had side effects. The same dollar that paid for energy also financed America's deficits on kinder terms than most nations could imagine. The same system that made the energy trade predictable also persuaded central banks everywhere to hold larger dollar reserves, just in case. The same pipes that carried confidence also carried leverage. Offshore pools of dollars grew. Lenders lent farther and cheaper. Borrowers, governments, and companies alike took the rate the market offered and told themselves the tide would never turn. Inflation said otherwise. Prices ran ahead of wages. Expectations drifted. A central banker in a plain suit walked into a gray building and chose the harder road. Interest rates were lifted. Lifted again, lifted until the word money felt scarce in the mouth. Factories dimmed, farms auctioned, unemployment cut. But the signal was unmistakable, and it traveled beyond the borders. The dollar would be defended by policy, not nostalgia. It would be worth holding because those who issued it were willing to bear pain to keep faith. Capital ran uphill. The dollar surged. For foreign borrowers who had taken dollar loans when money was easy, the climb turned manageable debts into cliffs. Revenues arrived in local currency. Obligations were due in a unit that strengthened by the week. One country announced it could not pay, then others. The phrase debt crisis turned from headline to curriculum. A generation learned the difference between borrowing in your own unit and borrowing in someone else's. Diplomacy put handrails on the staircase. Finance ministers met at a New York hotel with chandeliers and hammered out a plan to guide the dollar down towards something friendlier for trade. Traders remember the two words, Plaza Accord. The yen and the mark rose. American exports breathed. Imbalances eased without a break in confidence. 2 years later, another meeting sketched a pause, an attempt to keep currencies within mutually tolerable ranges. Floating, it turned out, still had pilots in turbulence. At home, the fever broke. Inflation retreated, growth resumed. A phrase became policy shorthand, a strong dollar. It did not mean strong at any cost. It meant openness to foreign capital, deep and transparent markets, no deliberate cheapening to chase exports. More than the line itself, the behavior behind it built a reputation. If you needed to hold size on a bad day, you held it in the place that paid its bills, kept its courts predictable, and allowed you to sell without a prayer to your broker. The 1990s stress-tested that reputation. In Mexico, a peg snapped and money ran. A rescue arrived in days. Confidence returned faster than textbooks predicted. In East Asia, success hid fragility. Corporations had borrowed short in dollars and lent long in local currency. When sentiment turned, the elevators moved only one way. Pegs broke, output fell, reforms followed. In Russia, a default spread from bonds to belief, and a giant hedge fund in New York, engineered to survive almost anything, found the one chain of events that could break it. Each time, the same choreography: sell what is narrow, buy what is deepest, wince, stabilize, write a better rulebook. Move on. Reserve piles grew like levees after a flood. Countries that had learned how quickly hot money flows out decided to keep more cold money on hand, often in dollars, often in treasuries, frequently sterilized at home to keep exchange rates from lurching. It was insurance, and it had a price. More demand for the same deep assets, more integration through the same narrow pipes. The safer the system felt, the more it depended on the currency that made it feel safe. Somewhere between those rescues and new acronyms, the dollar's role changed again. Less a metal memory, more a clearing architecture. Oil and grain invoices defaulted to dollars. Airplanes and microchips were insured in dollars. Derivatives that hedged everything from weather to wheat were struck in dollars. Courts that refereed cross-border disputes assumed dollar contracts and New York law. The dollar did not just sit in wallets or vaults. It saturated the pipes, settlement systems, collateral agreements, margin calls, corporate treasuries. It was habit as network, the boring miracle of frictionless transfer. Meanwhile, Europe answered a different question. Could a continent with separate parliaments share one money? The euro arrived as accounting entries, then as notes and coins that smelled of ink and promise. It bundled scale and the rule of law. It lacked a single treasury. When stress hit, bond yields asked the quiet question out loud: who backstops whom and how far? A central banker's 3 words, whatever it takes, stood where a fiscal union did not. The currency lived. For some savers, it became a second safe shelf. For the dollar, it became a serious colleague, not yet a replacement. China answered with a different experiment. Build trade in your own unit and build pipes that work even when others try to turn valves. Invoices shifted, swap lines spiderwebbed. An offshore yuan market let money move after mainland business hours. A domestic digital currency began to hum through phones. Payment rails that did not depend on Western switches came online. For partners uncomfortable under sanction risk, this was a new road. For global savers, it was still a road under construction. Predictable courts, free movement, and deep panic-proof markets are slow to build and easy to wound. And in the background, a third voice arrived that asked permission of no capital city. Bitcoin offered rules without rulers, settlement across borders while you slept, scarcity enforced by code instead of committee. It was volatile in price and sturdy in logic. Around it, experiments bloomed. Smart contracts, tokenized credits, dollar-pegged coins that turned the greenback into pure software. Irony piled on irony. The most used crypto for trade often pointed back to the dollar, wrapping it in a faster skin instead of replacing it. By the turn of the century, three truths sat together like stones you could not move. First, the dollar no longer needed gold. It needed belief. Belief backed by institutions willing to suffer to keep promises. Second, energy, shipping, insurance, and finance had woven a habit so thick that changing the unit of account would feel like rewiring a city with the lights on. Third, when fear rose, all the theories bent to the same fact. The safest deep pool remained the same. Call to mind the years you felt in your bones. The mortgage rate that forced a decision. The currency swing that turned an opportunity into a pause. The headline whose acronyms became the month's new vocabulary. Now imagine those moments as pulses on the same wire. A wire that hums in dollars because habit, depth, and law are a more persuasive trinity than speeches and slogans. If you lived one of those pulses, type the number that etched into your memory. History is clearer when the abstraction fits your own ledger. But strength was also dependence, and dependence meant fragility of a new kind. The more the world stored its emergency savings in the same market, the more that market's calm mattered to everyone. The more companies borrowed in dollars because the rate was cheaper and the size available, the more exchange swings and policy shifts in Washington echoed in faraway payrolls. The more central banks leaned on swap lines that could be opened by friendly phone calls. The more they wondered what would happen if one day the call went to voicemail. Which is to say, the dollar's architecture solved the problems that broke its ancestors: speed, scale, law, and inherited a different set. Politics could now travel through payments. A sanction list could do what gunboats once did. A courthouse injunction in one city could freeze assets on another continent by breakfast. The more often those powers were used, the more energy others put into building alternate switches, alternate courthouses, alternate wires. Not to overthrow the standard in a weekend, but to give themselves exits, to make dependence optional where possible. Even so, habit kept winning on paydays, on ship days, on rollover days when a government's bond must be sold, when a factory's hedge must be placed, when an insurer must post collateral. The dollar's grip tightened when fear rose and loosened when calm returned. Resentment simmered. Use persisted. The paradox deepened. The currency most argued about was the currency most reached for, because nothing else could swallow size on the worst day of the worst week with so little drama. Stand at the edge of that paradox and look forward. Trading screens grew faster. Settlement cycles shortened. Software began to eat even the dullest corners of finance. Stablecoins moved dollars across borders at midnight. Payment networks ran on code and keys. Central banks prototyped digital cash. The question sharpened from what backs money to what rail does it ride and who runs the rail. A unit can keep its throne even if the road beneath it changes, so long as the courts stay predictable and the bid stays deep. Or the road can change enough that the throne slowly wheels to a different hall without anyone hearing the scrape. Pause the timeline right before the century's great test. Picture ports at dusk, cranes pausing, accountants staring at screens that show numbers where money should be, money where trust should be, trust where only a promise remains. Picture the same wire, humming. The next chapters will ask what happens when the world needs not just a unit of account and a store of value, but a fearless, tireless lender and market maker of last resort. The answer will not be a slogan. It will be a set of actions taken in weeks that felt like hours. and it will reveal whether the dollar's crown is costume jewelry or a tool forged for weather. Before we move, write one word you would grab in a sudden storm. Cash, treasuries, gold, Bitcoin, other. Pin it now, test it later. Then follow the light into the century where the dollar became not only the language of price, but the architecture of rescue. It began as a rumor inside balance sheets. There weren't enough dollars. Not enough to roll the funding by dawn, not enough to meet a margin call without selling what no one wanted to sell. Not enough to keep the gears oiled when everyone grabbed the same handle at once. It didn't look like a chart at first. It sounded like silence on phones that used to ring back. It felt like emails that began with temporarily and ended with until further notice. Spreads that had lived for years, as thin as a whisper, suddenly spoke in full voice. Safe paper went unloved. Unsafe paper went missing. Money, which had spent a decade pretending to be everywhere, revealed how quickly it could be nowhere. And then the institution at the center did something both old and new. Until then, the story is practical. A ship loads fuel. A factory hedges copper. A government must roll debt by Friday. Screens blink. Traders yawn. The wire hums. The bill clears. The habit holds. And the dollar, argued about, leaned on, doubted, defended, keeps doing the thing that made it king. It shows up when it matters. A pension fund hedges 30 years of obligations and doesn't want a unit that surprises it. A shipping line finances hulls and wants to borrow where the buyer of last resort never leaves. A startup stitches together 5 APIs and needs a currency that can be wrapped a dozen times without tearing. A central bank runs a fire drill on a screen and counts how many minutes it would take to open a line if markets freeze on a Tuesday. All of them, for now, answer the same way. You can be skeptical, and you should. You can list the warnings, and you should. You can imagine a different map, and you should. But remember the test that crowns and uncrowns, quietly beneath the speeches. Who shows up when it matters? The answer today is the answer it has been for a long time, not because it must be, but because it keeps being. Picture that last image again, not as a metaphor, but as an X-ray. Paper lifts. Code shows through. The portrait is still there if you squint, but the rails carry most of the weight now. A payment leaves Manila, touches 3 nodes in Singapore, Zurich, and New York, and arrives in Oaxaca before lunch. A hedge placed on a Tuesday in Rotterdam meets a price in Chicago and a margin call in Tokyo on Wednesday. A sanctions list updates, a compliance screen glows, a route reroutes, and the cargo still loads by midnight. The unit is a story written in routines. If you had to promise your future self one thing to check 10 years from now, make it practical. Not who rules, but what clears. Not what should, but what did. Pin it in your head like a comment you can't delete. On the worst day, where did size go? Some nights, the answer will disappoint you. Some years, the answer will anger you. The story will not flatter anyone all the time, but the story, like the unit at its center, is still told in the same language, calm where it counts. The mechanic counts the day's cash and sends a little home. The nurse checks for a receipt and smiles. The treasurer locks his desk and goes to meet friends. The trader stares at a last blinking icon and finally exhales. The hum never stops. The crown never sleeps. The pipes never brag. They just carry the weight.
On markets that remain open when others close, it rests on the same quiet metric that decided for the guilder and the pound. On the worst day, where can you actually put size? Yet permanence is not part of the contract. Technology is cutting new channels. Payments clear in seconds. Tokens wrap old money in faster clothes. Central banks experiment with digital cash. Private networks move value at the speed of text. If rails change enough, does the cargo change with them, or does the dollar simply learn to travel lighter? Politics redraws boundaries. Sanctions make money speak the language of statecraft. Nations build parallel systems to reduce exposure. Trust, so slow to earn and so quick to bruise, becomes the most important asset on every balance sheet. How much policy can a currency carry before users seek a quieter road? Economics sets the floor. Deficits test patience. Demographics slow and shift. Growth moves along new meridians. A reserve currency can tolerate many doubts, but not the loss of deep, credible assets, nor the loss of a lender who can flood the world when faucets run dry. Perhaps the end, when it comes, looks less like collapse and more like dilution. More trade settled in other units, more reserves held in baskets, more contracts that hedge the political risk of any single pipe. Not a dethroning, but a crowding. Or perhaps the story is simpler. The dollar adapts again as it has, from metal to promise, from promise to network, from network to code. If usefulness remains, so will habit. Past reserve currencies left gifts when they stepped down. The guilder gave accounting and honesty in ledgers. The pound gave the craft of central banking and global clearing. The dollar's legacy, already visible, may be the architecture. Swap lines that act like fire hoses, markets that can hold panic without breaking, and a template for how a currency can be both national and, in practice, shared. For now, the evidence is plain. When a ship loads fuel, when a factory hedges copper, when a government must roll debt by Friday, the wire still hums in dollars. The complaints are real. The alternatives are growing. The choice, today, remains the same. If the dollar's era ends, it will be because use has moved elsewhere, not because a slogan said it should. Until then, the story continues, revised, questioned, tested, and retold each time a price prints on a screen and clears without drama. A last look, paper, ink, the familiar portrait. The bill softens at the edges grain by grain and resolves into light, rectangles and lines drifting across a dark map like constellations. A dollar, fading into digital code, not vanishing, changing, as the story moves on.